Welcome to another episode of Just More Fix. This is James. With me in this episode is Lacey.
Hey.
You can find us online at justonemorefix.com or on Twitter at justonemorefix. If you like us, you can support us at Patreon, and you can give us a rating and review at iTunes or wherever you find us at. In this episode, we're going to talk about who's actually responsible for story. And now, it's time to get our gaming picks.
Michelle Ely from the Starling Tribune, an Arrow TV show fan podcast, part of the Geek network, just like the show you're checking out now. Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other amazing geeky shows at GonnaGeekNetwork.com.
Welcome to Just More Fix. A couple quick announcements today. First off, you hear us mention it all the time now. We set our dates for HillCon. So HillCon this year is November 1st through November 3rd. So if any of you out there are looking for a weekend to set aside to get some gaming going on and do some awesome fun times with friends.
Pick your own weekend. No.
or you can coincide it with ours, which would be awesome. And it'd be good to know that there's other people out there sort of doing some Halloween-ish All Souls Day gaming, I guess. And just set aside some time for good food, good games, and good friends, and play some awesome games and have a good time. Second announcement is that we are moving forward with our Proto-Spiel plan, and it looks like our first one is going to be sometime in October. As we continue to pull together those details, we will have a date to confirm once we get that set with the game store and whatnot. And our final announcement is Hastings Party has been a little bit delayed, but we are on track to have it. Actually, not on track. We are finishing up as we speak. It's going to get one last final editing pass, and then I have an isometric map that I am finishing up the details on. And other than that, everything is finalized and put together. And the PDF we'll be throwing the PDF up as soon as that gets done. So probably within the next 7 to 10 days that should be done. And our printer is local as well, so I'll be getting a proof of that back and getting that sent out to all of our backers in the next couple weeks here. So super excited for that. And we are starting process for sort of brainstorming and putting things together for the Three Sisters zine, which will be our next one that'll be due out November. And should be a good time. Lots of terrible, awesome horror stuff. And we're going to brainstorm an episode for that one. Or not brainstorm, GameStorm an episode for that one that'll be releasing here within the next couple episodes, probably, once we get that sort of put together. All right, so today we are going to talk about who's responsible for story at the table. And this kind of came out of an interesting conversation that we had with someone that reached out to us about how we create stories and role-playing games involved with some sort of a research project, and had a really interesting conversation, and some cool things came out of it, and some things that I hadn't considered before. So the first part of that is, if we are at the table, who is actually responsible for the story?
Me.
Just you.
Solely me. Yeah, everybody at the table is responsible for the story.
So
I know this because one person can kill the whole story. Therefore, every person must be responsible on some level.
Right, but see, here's my problem with that. So initially, I'm just going to pose the question in sort of like this broad sense, right? Mm-hmm. And then after that, I want to break it down for a couple different game systems, because I think that does play a small role in it, right? But in a general sense, I agree with what you're saying, that everyone at the table is responsible for the story. However, there's also this thing that if everyone is responsible, then no one is.
What? Where do they say that?
Like actual real leadership stuff. So, do you agree with that premise or no?
I mean, like, if everyone is responsible, no one is. That's like a thing you say about tasks. But that's not a thing you say about the mission of your organization.
No,
you better believe everybody's like, you're all responsible for that.
Yeah, I agree, but like I'm thinking like
it's like, yeah, I mean, there are tasks involved that sort of help keep the things flowing and keep things moving, and those are generally like GM responsibility. But like everybody shares at least a part of the responsibility for making the story good.
I agree with that. Like everybody, it's a broadly speaking a generalized shared experience, but I think someone ultimately does have, like, an individual has to be responsible. Otherwise, it sort of devolves into, like, well, this kind of amorphous thing where no one is. Do you know what I mean? Like everyone has a role in it, but there has to be someone pushing things forward to make sure that everyone is paying attention to the story. Do you know what I'm saying? Well, what are you thinking? Like, that's a giant long pause, so.
I don't know. I was trying to think of a good example to prove you wrong, but my brain's just kind of right now. I was trying to come up with a good counterpoint to your argument.
Well, if you think back to whether it was a game you ran or games that you played in, and those specific games that had what you would think of as the best story, whether whether it was for you individually or for the group at the table, who was the driving force behind that story in those games?
I told you already, it was me.
Okay, fair enough.
I don't know, but I think it was everybody, because in the game that I liked, there was some plot points, but they were sort of loosely based on what we seemed to be wanting to do anyway.
What game is this you're talking about?
And, well, the most recent one that I've enjoyed quite a lot was the medieval game that Kurt ran. I mean, he had like a well-developed world, because he always has a well-developed world. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, there were things going on in the outside world, but each individual character also had their own goals and motivations that they were trying to achieve, and were kind of creating their own stories that way as well. And I think if any one of those things wasn't present, then it would not have been nearly as
successful.
Fun.
See, so part of the problem for me with this question is, and I'm going to come around to what you're talking about in that case, right, is that in that game, there was 3 players and Kurt running, right? And I guess my question is like, I realize that yes, everyone is responsible, but I feel like our table is a little unfair to base things on, because most tables aren't like our table. I feel like our tables are, generally speaking, now not in this case, but are generally speaking 50-50 male to female. Our tables are all veteran, role players for the most part, all people that are down to sacrifice character for story. In that kind of a self-sacrifice kind of a way, where story comes first, basically, right? We're all down for difficult role-playing moments. We're all down for moments of horror, along with moments of, like, greatness and epicness and whatever. And but I think the biggest piece of that is that we're all experienced role players in those story kind of elements, right? So when I say at our table, well, yeah, everyone's responsible for it. I think that's kind of a gimme, because we're all sort of like veteran role players, right? But if you were to take this concept to newer role players that maybe had been playing tabletop games for a year, 2 years, or even less than that, and try to make something in as an idea for this is who is responsible for the story at your table, right? When you have people that aren't seasoned players or whatever, or seasoned game masters, like, is it the same argument there that it's everyone? Or do you frame that argument different because of the experience of the players at the table?
I think that if you're an experienced role player, you're an experienced GM, you're a new GM or whatever, that's how you should be setting up your table. Like, that's how you avoid the shitty experiences that people have when players wreck their story for no good reason that you just hear
right.
over and over and over again.
Well, no, I definitely
make your
agree.
Players accountable for the story, and then they won't crap all over it.
So do you think that's a conversation that we've gone back to over and over again about setting expectations for what the game is going to be about and what you're setting out to do?
Oh, that's part of it, I think. But making characters that have goals, understanding what your players' expectations are from your game, as well as it's a two-way street, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, you may not always know that straight out the gate, but
right. Another important thing I forgot to mention in terms of our table is that we have been playing games together for a long time. Our gaming group has been essentially like that in that game you mentioned there has been together for 13 plus years, basically, right? But and then in the case of Greg had been at my gaming table for even longer than that, or longer than you, and then you have been at the table for 15 years, basically, essentially, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess I have this weird feeling that, and this is when we got asked a question, I felt like this is one of those kind of unanswerable questions, right? But then I thought, well, even if everyone has a different answer, what is my answer, right? Who is responsible for the story, and knowing that, how do you set things up to make it so you're most likely to succeed, right? Mm-hmm. So then I started comparing different games that we've had. So the Sabbat game, right? It was just set up with expectations of having fun and let's make some crazy powerful characters and go wreck stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And while there was a story in there somewhere, it developed as time went by, but it didn't start off as a story. Do you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. But great fun game, and it had a story. It may not have been the most, giant amount of depth to that story, at least at the beginning of it, but it grew as time went on.
Yeah, and we all had individual character goals, too.
Right. Destroy
things, Diablerize everyone.
Right.
Those are pretty solid goals.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the case of that game, I would say initially that the person responsible for story in that game was initially me, because that game was just a Sabbat game set up to go wreck things in the modern time, right? Mm-hmm. So basically my job was just put disaster in front of you and watch you guys blow things up and tear things to pieces, right? So, like, as players, your roles were more reactionary, I would say, in that specific case, at the beginning of it. Now, as time went by, the story grew and developed because things had happened and whatever, right? Now, in the case of something that's happening right now with Night Witches, is that initially the burden of story was on me. And I feel like this is true of a lot of games, at least out the gate, is because we're setting things up, right?
Sensing a common thread here.
But something that you guys said when we were kind of like debriefing after our last game session was that basically now the four of you are responsible for the story. And I'm just reacting to what you are doing, right? Now, obviously, in terms of sort of consequences for missions and stuff like that, that stuff is entirely in my court for the most part, right? Mm-hmm. But now there's so much stuff that's happened. It's basically just me reacting largely to what you all do, while I put some small obstacles in there. And I it feels like the 70-30 that was shared initially at the beginning of the game with mostly me sort of setting things up and building story has shifted the other way to where it's 70-30, you as players dictating what is happening and me sort of reacting to what you all are doing. Does that seem fair? Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I kind of feel like as the GM, your responsibility at that point becomes less about creating story and more about being sure that you create obstacles that are going to result in enough shared story time.
Sharing spotlight.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So then it becomes more about managing how the story unfolds as opposed to the content of the story, if that makes sense.
No, I think so, because I think that improvisation part about here's this problem that you're overcoming. How do I take that problem that you have created and are dealing with and shift it to where now it doesn't involve just you. Now it can involve 2 or 3 other characters at the same time because you need their help or you need their advice or whatever it is. So, yeah.
And I also think that you can kind of step back a little bit from plot setup and then focus more on how to evoke different highs and lows of emotion at that point, too.
That's true, because then it does give you, you're less worried about steering the story as opposed to, being 2 bumpers, right? And you're sort of keeping it in the lane. And, yeah, no, I think that's a great analogy, because then, there's some things that when we talk about stuff that just sort of come out where it's I guess I really am doing that more than I thought I was. In that exact example right there, really I'm just trying to find ways to push the emotional notes that already exist in that game, right? And using the tools that we've already set up and the characters that we've already set up to do those things, right? And it's less about the finite plot points of making sure things line up correctly, because fundamentally you all are already doing that, so I set out something where there's this weird thing that happens, maybe there's some conspiracy, and then all of you are throwing around ideas about who's responsible for it. Meanwhile, I'm listening, jotting down notes and being like, which one of these seems like they're the most passionate about? And then that's generally the one I choose, unless I can foresee some other kind of weird twist that can happen down the road or whatever, It's just an interesting way to look at that, whereas instead of paying more attention to the nitty-gritty of the story and the details there, I've sort of turned those reins over to all of you, and I'm trying to guide more the emotional highs and lows that are happening. And I don't know.
Well, that's like the game within the game, right? You spend all this time setting it up and pushing it down, but the part that's fun for the GM is trying to get a different kind of emotional reaction from someone to make the story meaningful. That's the part that's fun, you know. So yeah, I feel like the whole first part is just seeing if seeing if the roller coaster is going to work. And then after that, you're like, all right, now let's see what other cool things I can do. Like, hey, it stayed on the rails. That was neat. Now what can we do?
Well, I know that I know that I go to the Night Witches game to reference things a fair amount. And part of it is because, one, I really enjoy it. Two, it's because people out there listen to it so they can kind of have a feel for exactly what it is referring to. But also, that game is different than anything else I've ever really ran. And I think part of it is because of our table chemistry. Now we've had, gaming groups before and tables before that have all had great chemistry. But this time it's just different. And I think it's...
Right. Well, it's because vaginas are magic.
Well, that very well may be. But I think it's an emotional investment in the game. And I know part of that is because when I first pitched the game to all of you, everyone came to the table with a certain amount of excitement and this is really a cool thing to do. And we've never had a gaming group that was structured in the way that Night Witches is structured. So there was some new hotness to that there too, and all that kind of stuff. And I wonder, and this is kind of getting a little bit off of who's responsible for the story, but maybe that comes back to the Game Master though, because in a way, when I pitched that game to all of you and set it up, I pitched the game. I sold the idea to you. It was a cool new thing to try in terms of mechanics and game and what it's about. And then the content of the game is really cool and exciting. And so that all falls back on the Game Master to do that, right? Because you're not going to be the player to pitch the game for the storyteller to run. Be like, look, this game is amazing and you should run it for me.
Just really not a GM. You'd be like, no, listen, Ted, you don't understand. I heard about this cool new game called Trail of Cthulhu. I really think you should check it out.
Well, I've been thinking about some of these things differently because Hot Springs Island is kind of drawing to a close, and I'm looking at...
Is it, though?
Well, in a way, as a chapter, I suppose it will probably come to a close, But what I'm trying to distill down is the things that we have done with Night Witches specifically that I could take to another game and say, I'm going to use those techniques in the Yellow King, right? Mm-hmm. So that I can have that sort of same level of passion and excitement and success with something else. If that makes any sense whatsoever.
Yeah, I think so.
So, all right. So I realize it's kind of been a big wandering ramble, largely about who knows, because I feel like everyone, in a way I agree that everyone is responsible, but initially it has to be on the GM to get that started, right? Mm-hmm. So now I'm going to totally contradict myself and say that there is a couple circumstances in which this is not the case at all. It actually is everyone. That's like Fiasco, right? GM-less games, basically.
They say they're GM-less, right? But there's still, it's kind of like when you sit down to play a board game and one person really loves the board game and has read all the rules for the board game. They maybe even have played the game before. They at the very least watch some how it's done videos or, something to that effect. They've played 8,000 other board games, so they're familiar with... it's GM-less, sure. But one person definitely has a much better idea what's going on than the rest of the table.
But I think that they're more of a facilitator in that sense, and maybe right,
but how is that different?
Because they're not necessarily... There's no one person that has control of the world that can guide things. And I feel like that's the difference with Fiasco versus any other RPG or any other GM-less one, whether that's...
But you're never the only person that has control of the world and is guiding things.
No, what I'm saying, though, is that in a D&D game or any other conventional role-playing game, right? If you're the game master, you're the storyteller, whatever it is, you sort of have the reins to the world to do what you want with, essentially, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas in Fiasco, it's sort of like this shared understanding of what the world is and sort of like this push-pull where everyone definitely has a piece of the story and creative control of what's happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, you mutually create the world.
Right. Well, and you go around, you're picking your different choices and things. And I mean, there's other GM-less games that are out there as well. But I just feel like when you introduce a game master into it, it very clearly changes things, right? Because now there's someone who has more authority, however you want to say that in the world. Do you know what I mean? To dictate certain things or whatever. And then does that authority come with the inherent responsibility to say, I am the one who is in charge of making the story happen. Do you think that's true or no?
I think you have more investment in it. Like, you've put more work into it.
Right.
So, I mean, it's just, yeah, it's exactly, it's more investment. You have more to lose than anybody else at the table as far as just solidly time investment. Mm-hmm. And maybe some emotional investment too. I mean, it's something that you created. You want people to enjoy it. There's some personal stake there.
Oh, well, there's another. I kind of broke this down into a couple different categories, but I think you just mentioned a third one for like you created it, right? So for pre-published adventures, obviously the person who's responsible for the story is the person that wrote the adventure, right? So
it's much less different than Fiasco.
Right, yeah. So, like, I guess that, like, in one category, you'd have, like, your GM-less games, right? And that is very clearly a shared responsibility. And then if you go into, like, your more conventional role-playing games, then it's definitely on the publisher or the writer, designer of the game, right?
Well, not solely, no.
Well, maybe.
You're still the one that read the book and is going to be interpreting it. Like, there's definitely some skill involved there, and it could for sure be an excellent book that you just mucked up in your running of it. Like, that's a possibility.
Oh, yeah. Right, absolutely. Right on.
Particularly, like, depending on what kind of adventure it is, you know, if it's something with a little bit of choice built in and it's not just complete box text.
Right.
Then
requires a little more finesse to sort of make it work or whatever. Right on. So I'm just going to break these down and see system-wise. I feel like I feel in a way that when we're talking about like who's responsible in a game master situation, we're kind of on the same page that like the game master might sort of like be in more of a shepherd role, but everyone still has a responsibility for the story, right? So do you feel like that changes any?
Shepherd is not quite strong enough. I don't want to say God because that comes with a lot of like,
right?
You know, emotional attachment, but really,
conductor.
Like, I've created this thing.
Yeah,
gave you some hard rules and some soft ones,
right?
And I'm just gonna subtly manipulate things from over here, like.
I see what you're saying though, because like in a shepherd sense, you're like, well, maybe not. And this, I think, ties into where I'm gonna go with this. Where in,
I feel like shepherds don't quite have enough agency,
right,
to really be like a good analogy.
So hang on. I think it may apply in some situations though. So let me follow this thought through. Right. So when you take games that are more like D&D Pathfindery, right? I think that you are very correct in saying that that's more of like I have absolute control over the world, right? And that's just sort of how those games are structured. Not 100% of the time, but largely they are, right? And I think that's where the players are looking to the storyteller or game master in that sense, dungeon master, for challenges to be laid in front of them for them to overcome, and then the story to evolve from those challenges, right?
I guess
would you agree with that or no?
I'm always looking for that in a game. I would like for you to present me some challenges, and then I would like to figure out how to overcome them.
Right, but when you look at
in fact, I'm annoyed when that does not happen.
But hang on. So, like, when you look at your character creation section, though, for a D&D game or a Pathfinder game or an OSR game, there's no section in there that talks about personal character goals during character creation.
Right, but they make your character better if you have them.
Right, but it's not inherent. It's not like built into it, right? There's no.
I feel like it's an oversight, though. You know, it's built into the concept of a role-playing game. The fact that it's not there, sort of like.
I kind of agree, but I kind of disagree.
It's just since I've been role-playing for this long, I feel like maybe it was just overlooked, and we were supposed to be doing it the whole time.
But I kind of don't think so. In a way, I think if you want that in there, then that's great, and then it gives you more agency in the story, right? And it shows the game master that these are things that I want to pursue, right? But I feel like, in a way, the structure of D&D in that doesn't put that in there makes it sort of that implied that the game master has ultimate authority here, and it's their job to lay this world out in front of you, and it's on them to do that, not on you to create that as a player. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah. And I feel like that's part of the inherent bias, or not the inherent bias, but like I feel like that's part of the implied bias when you read how you create a character. Do you know what I'm saying? And that's started to go away with a little bit with the 5e, with some of the background packages and that kind of stuff, because it sort of implies that in there that you could develop that out even more if you wanted to.
Right. Very like the burning wheel concept.
Yeah.
Right, with the life paths. So you end up with some character development, like it or not.
Yes. It's like, yeah. At first I was a peasant, and then I was a farmer, and then I was a goat herder.
So at least you have some kind of history
Yeah.
about how your life has gone so
Right.
far. I didn't just wake up today as a level 5 hobo murderer.
Right. Poor hobos always being murdered. Right. So with that kind of being the premise for for D&D style games, right? With World of Darkness, it very specifically talks about in the character creation section of like making character goals, long-term and short-term goals for your character. Like it specifically lays that out and talks about that. So I feel like in those kind of games, World of Darkness stuff, generally speaking.
First of all, it says that explicitly in there.
Yes.
I clearly never read that.
Yeah, so
paragraph.
now I'm not 100% sure on the V5, but I do know...
I definitely put more thought into my character,
Yeah.
you know, because, well, you're forced to pick merits and flaws, basically, and, you know, like...
But even beyond that, though, like when you look in the section about character creation, before you get to the quick reference table, it's always got these, like, 21 questions that asks you, who are you in life, in the case of Vampire.
Yeah, I think I probably literally never read any of those.
Right.
That's the other thing, right? Like when you're a GM versus a player. Like as a player, I'm reading as little. I mean, as a GM, I'm probably reading as little of the book as possible too. But as a player, it's like extra nil. The only reason I picked this book up at all is to figure out roughly the stats and numbers that are going to go on my sheet.
Well, but then that becomes incumbent on the storyteller to say, hey, I'm going to ask you these questions because I don't see them on your character sheet when I look it over.
How many World of Darkness games have we played?
I don't know, a gajillion.
So what does it say that I had no idea that was a thing?
But I feel like at the same time, you didn't know it was expressly written in the book, but you've already been doing it because we've told you to do it. So whether you read it or not, the information got passed along for you to do it.
Yeah,
so it's still a win.
Maybe.
There's no maybe.
I'm not sure.
Because you just said I make these characters with goals in mind, and then I said
figured that out because if I didn't do it, shit was boring and I didn't know what to do.
Oh well,
I don't think anybody told me that to begin with. I know nobody at LARP told me that to begin with because I was just wandering around like, wow, is something gonna happen, or should I just like sit in this room and hang out for a while?
Right. Either way, though, it is specifically written in there to make your characters with those things in mind.
Interesting.
So, what about? I feel like I'm just going to go through a couple different like broad categories of game, right? So, PBTA games are a great example of things that are made to get off the ground quickly, and they ask you very specific questions, right, in the design of the game, like choose someone at the table who knows your dark secret about whatever it is. Choose someone who you witnessed, doing something terrible, and it has all these questions in there to sort of build that basis for sort of like personal story into the game. Mm-hmm. And then for some of them, it even has questions for the MC to ask the players to sort of set the ball in motion for what's happening in the world.
Right. Well, and then the names of the skills in the system gave you more information about your character than, use rope. That tells me nothing about who I am as a person.
Right.
But, dark secret, that tells me a little something.
Right. Well, in that case, those moments come from the designer. And when they're explicitly putting things in there that you can't avoid to do this, right? Mm-hmm. So
I like that. Like, it reminds me of the concept from creating Dread characters, right? Where the question isn't so much like how I want you to answer the question is inherent in the question. It's not so much like, do you have a medical condition? It's like, how does your condition manifest itself? You know what I mean? So it's like leading questions.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, because then because a lot of people will just automatically not take.
Right, be like, no, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
That would be dumb.
Right, why would I want narcolepsy?
Not like, who did you murder? It was like, how did you murder your third husband?
Right, yeah. And then the question is, did you actually murder your first two? Right.
That's a subtle thought that happens after that. Mm-hmm. You have to ask it.
Right. But those ones are all sort of, in the case of PBTA stuff, they're already written into it in that way, right? Now, I feel like in a way you can kind of separate Trail of Cthulhu and Call of Cthulhu in this case, because so far as I know, Call of Cthulhu doesn't have anything in there where you like your pillars of stability and sanity and all that stuff, right? Those are not automatically in the mechanics of Call of Cthulhu, but they are in Trail. In Call of Cthulhu, it's definitely on the keeper more so to lay out the mystery, right? Because
more so than in Trail of Cthulhu?
Well,
is that what you're...
I will say this. The elements of the control that the storyteller has to have in Call of Cthulhu to lay out an investigation also exist in Trail. However, the difference is that there are the pieces on the character sheet for Pillars of Sanity, or who is it that I take care of and who takes care of me in the case of the Yellow King role-playing game. Those are put on there in the same way that the PBTA questions are in a way. So these are the people that I go to keep my brain from breaking in two, right? Mm-hmm. And those are connections for the keeper to push on and tools for them to engage with to connect to the story and draw things out of, right?
Yeah, I don't think that's comparable to what you're talking about with PBTA games.
Well, it's definitely not as good, but it's in the case of the Yellow King, it might be, and we haven't seen it in action yet, but the two ones that are in the Yellow King game are not Pillars of Sanity in that way. It's who takes care of me and who do I take care of. Mm-hmm. So in those two cases...
Well, it's an extra story fiddly bit, yeah, right. But it's not the same kind of... It's not, I check this box and this gives me some kind of characteristic about who I am. It's more involved than that. Yeah. There's more thought to it than that.
Okay. No, I agree with that very much. Yeah. It's not so, there's no prompts for you to just sort of, I don't know what I'm going to take. I'll just pick this one. Sounds good. Moving on. Right. Yeah. I agree with that. But in a way, there's this connection in my mind between D&D style games in terms of the powers of the GM and the Trail of Cthulhu investigative style games, because granted, they're two totally separate things tonally, right? But...
Well, you have to have more control in an investigative game than you do. I mean, there's no sandbox investigative game. That's not a thing. Maybe it is a thing. I don't know. I don't know what that looks like, though. My brain does not want to make that. That's like a square peg trying to go in a round
dossier,
hole.
Which is like, terrifying in a way. Because it's so big. Fit. It's so big. So, but I just... In a way, there has to be more ability for the game master to sort of unleash the horror on you, like that cosmic sense of cosmic horror that comes from the storyteller having more control over things, and then also you sort of have to have more control in order to sort of like reveal the clues to the players as the game goes on, right? Otherwise, it's not much of a mystery investigation if they already know.
I guess you could play a sandbox game where it's like, it's really irrelevant whether you find out if this elder god is being resurrected or not, because it's happening.
Suck it up, Buttercup, it's happening.
If you want to go to the, Piggly Wiggly and get a Slurpee instead, whatever.
Right. So are there any other games, I don't know if Fate bears mentioning, and if it has any significant differences in terms of who's in charge of story for that? Well, maybe it does with the fate points, because you can spend a fate point to sort of like...
Well, no, but aside from that, in the fate book, very much says that you are creating the setting as a group.
Oh, right, yeah.
Do we do that? Not very often, but it's definitely in there.
Right.
Where it says, okay, you sit down, and then everybody decides what kind of games they want to play. And then Carl's like, I want to play in space. And then Ellen is like, yeah, but with gorillas. And then Carl's like, well, how's that different than Planet of the Apes? And then like Eugenia's over here, well, it's different because the apes are dumb. And I don't know. I kind of got off on a tangent there. You see what I'm saying?
But they're creating a shared world.
Right.
Whereas most of the Fate games that we've played, there's already a world that everyone kind of already understands that we're engaging with, I guess.
Yes. That was my point.
Mm-hmm. So I have an interesting one to mention here. You already mentioned Dread, and I think Dread is an interesting case for this because it's not it's a very loose, it's almost a storytelling game. It's very, very loose in terms of mechanisms for the ways things work, right? Mm. So in the case of Dread, who would you say is more responsible for the story?
The GM.
Okay, I agree. I feel like that's the case in any kind of horror game, basically, right? But what about 10 Candles?
I think it's still the GM.
Do you think so?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of... Because I didn't really make any decisions exactly in that game.
Now,
I mean...
The only reason I suggest 10 Candles being different is because when I have been running that game, it seems to me more like I am reacting to what all of you are doing. We already have this broad premise of what is causing the world to end, right? And we already know that all of the characters are going to die. Mm-hmm. So it ventures into that sort of two bumpers territory for me, where I'm trying to bounce the characters back and forth between the bumpers and keep them headed down the path between these emotional moments of a little bit of success, terror, a little bit of success, terror, and doing that while the characters are steering themselves towards the inevitable end. But I don't know if that's because the way 10 Candles is structured, in that we already know that we're all going to die.
I don't know. I guess maybe I had goals. You know, like there was somebody else with me, and it was just always going to be like, we'll keep them alive as long as possible. Mm-hmm. But again, it was very much like the GM's world, and like I knew, like you were making, like it was always going to end with me dying. So, right. Yeah, I don't know.
Because
it feels, I don't know, like sort of similar to like Bluebeard's Bride.
What do you mean?
Well, I just feel like the GM has most of the agency in that game.
Yes and no, though, because at the end of each room, the bride gets to choose whether it's a token of loyalty or a token of disloyalty. Mm-hmm. So isn't that a fair amount of control over the overall story?
Is it?
Well, having played the game and knowing all of the potential endings, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't want to spoil it for anybody, so I'm not going to do that. But I think that there is... Okay, let me take one step back, right? In Bluebeard's Bride, and in the case of 10 Candles, the end is already set, essentially, right? Mm-hmm. More or less. There's some questions at the end of Bluebeard, but largely it's a done deal. We know what's going to happen, right? But that's not where the story happens in my mind. That's where the story ends. The story happens in that middle. And that's where in the case of Bluebeard, you get to choose the tokens of loyalty or tokens of disloyalty, right? And I feel like that is a significant amount of control over the overall story. Now, in each individual room, yes, the game master has a tremendous amount of control over the world and over the horrors that you encounter. But I also think that in the case of it being a PBTA game, the players have a tremendous amount of authority for the story when they get to roll dice, and it says, answer these questions or choose these things, and they just are true. That's what is happening in the world, right? Mm-hmm. So whether you choose to caress a horror, or whether you choose to run away from, flee in terror, or sully yourself with violence, those are all pretty big moments of deciding where the story is going to go from there. Now, there might be some randomness to how the rolls go, but I just... It seems different to me. And I don't know if it's because the end is already done and in place, that now we're playing to find out not what happened, but why this happened. Does that make any sense at all? Or help? Do you know?
I don't know. I don't know. I just... And
it may be that we just see these two things drastically differently. I mean, but like...
I'm just trying to think of like how much... So we're talking about ownership of the story. Mm-hmm. How much ownership of the story you really have in each game. And it would seem to me that actually in games like Dread, you have quite a lot of ownership of the story. Because you basically are deciding everything that you're doing. And truthfully, in most cases, you'll be successful in whatever endeavor you choose to undertake, unless you're really terrible at Jenga, right?
Right.
Probability wise, you'll succeed every time until you don't.
It's that last
and
one.
then even then you get
doozy.
agency and at least a little bit of agency in how you die.
Well, are we changing now what we're talking about from agency to responsibility, though?
No,
Or are those
because
the same
agency is
things?
part of your ownership of the story.
Okay. That's fair. I was
Like,
just
it's
asking.
the decision about what happens to my character
Right.
in the story.
Right. No, it's fair. I was just curious as you used a different word, if it was shifting things into a different...
No, I think
category.
it's talking about the same thing. Like, when you talk about agency, you're talking about your ability to impact the story.
Right.
And that, that kind of comes back to who's responsible for the story as well. Yeah. And so I don't know. I'm just trying to picture... I see what you're saying about Bluebeard's Bride, but then I see when I run that game, I am doing most of the talking.
That's true. And then... Well, I just wondered now if it wasn't like sort of like the terrifying genius of that game is that it gives the players control of the story to tell you, the game master, what terrifies them and how to bring the horror, right?
Well, and
without actually giving them any authority, because horror is based off the premises, especially in the case of Bluebeard, where it's feminine horror, is vulnerability is a huge element of that. And I wonder if the genius of that game isn't at a mechanical level. Yes, you can make these decisions, but emotionally you feel like you're just powerless.
But at a mechanical level, are you really making those decisions either? What are you doing? You're picking a key. No matter what happens, you're going to open a door.
Right.
No matter what happens when you go to that room, something bad is going to happen.
But hang on. So I feel like in those cases, picking the key, right, all that stuff, those are conceits of the game.
Right.
That's outside of the control of the game master or the players. That's a conceit of the game that says I will choose this ring, this key.
Right. What I'm saying is you're not really choosing anything. You're
yes
sort of
and no.
you're sort of impacting what I'm about to show you, but simply you're going to enter another room.
Okay, so let's
and
back up.
something bad is going to happen in the room.
Right. Let's back up though. Before you do that, when you make your character, it asks you all these questions. Mm-hmm. And using the answers from those questions is supposed to guide you as the groundskeeper in that case? Is that what it's called in Bluebeard?
I don't remember.
Either way, whatever it is. The MC for Bluebeard. I'm telling you the things sort of, ideally, those questions elicit the things that scare me or ways to attack me. Not necessarily physically, but attack me in that sort of horror, terrifying kind of a way, right? How do you scare me? And so, in a way, I feel, it's just a really crafty way to make it feel like you are creating this story that I didn't tell you how to scare me, but I actually did. It's like a magic trick. It's like you forget that you did that. You like you wrote your name on the card and folded it up, but they just fooled you into forgetting that you wrote it down. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
It's like this magic trick where, you fill in the blanks and you don't even realize you've done that. So in that way...
Like a cold read.
Yeah.
That's what a GM is. Somebody who's real good at cold reading.
But does that make sense in that way? In that you're sort of, I'm giving you the pieces to use to sort of terrify and scare me, and the buttons that I want to be pushed without knowing that I'm actually doing it. And maybe that's sort of like the elegance of that design, is that they've made you do that and then not make those two connections.
Is that the same thing as sharing in a story, though?
Well, I think that, so if I'm doing a card trick and you come on stage and pick the card and you're an unknowing participant in the magic trick, are you part of the magic trick?
Yeah. So
there. I think that's the answer right there, right? Is that whether you're a willing and knowing participant, well, you're at the table, so you're willing. But whether you're a knowing participant in it or not, doesn't matter. You have laid that groundwork out. Because think about how bad a Bluebeard's Bride game would be if you had 4 people at the table that gave all terrible, flat answers to those questions.
I think the game would still be good because I'm really good.
You're responsible, right? We got that.
Actually, no, it's a really good game, so I still think it would be fine.
I agree, it would be a good game, but I think that what takes things from being a good game to a great game is that personal touch. And when you get good answers from the players, it gives you a way to sort of put that personal twist on there, and you can see like, oh, I said our hair was this way, and that's, you know, a metaphor for this or whatever it is, and you can kind of take and twist that and sort of push that game to the next level. Does it make sense? Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I thought it would just be interesting to sort of talk this one through, because when we were talking about this before, I was like, this is a really deep question about like how you sort of view gaming and how you view running games versus how you view playing games. And there's 100 answers to this from 100 different people, but it just seemed like a really interesting question to pose, to, you know, to talk through, because I really wasn't even sure what I kind of had an idea what I thought, but then it's one of those things where you talk it through and you're like, oh, wait a minute, that's actually not what I think. You know what I mean? So I don't know.
So what do you think? I don't feel like you've ever actually answered the question.
So in my case, the way that I prefer to run games and tables that I like to play at, right? And I've even been able to do this at one-shots and convention games where it's people I'm not familiar with, right? So I don't know if it's just an experience thing, and that's what I've sort of evolved and came around to now, is that I believe that the story is I think that the people responsible for the story are actually the players. But I think it is the job of the storyteller to sort of shepherd them through this and draw that out of them, if that makes sense. It's in a way, it's sort of like everyone is responsible, but it's the game master's job to draw the story out of the players. It's their job to engage them and put challenges in front of them and characters and NPCs and events that engage them and engage their character and at a character level, but also at a personal level, that draws the story out of them. And then the player tells you how they react to it, and they tell you the story of their character and what they're doing. So So it's
everyone.
Yes, but in different ways.
Okay.
So it's I guess to break it just down is that it's the game master's job to draw the story out of the players and shepherd them together and sort of like corral them, right? And bounce them between those two bumpers of emotional upbeats and downbeats. And then it's the player's job to engage with the world around them and tell the story of their characters. I'm not going to say I'm like super experienced at doing this at conventions or whatever, or one-shots, but we've done a fair amount of them. And knock on wood, I haven't had any terrible stories. I've had some that were sort of like flat sessions or whatever. But I wouldn't say that I've had any big misses. But at the same time, I've been running games for a long time, and that improvisational style sort of suits me to bounce back and forth around. And PBTA has really strengthened me because they really give you new ways to look at things, or at least they did for me. And that's what has honed my ability to sort of make that happen. So what about you?
What about me? What?
Do you actually think that it's just everyone's a job and that's just what it is? Or is it more nuanced than that?
I find it a little bit insulting that you find only the storytelling narrative part as part of the story, and you just completely obliterated the entire, like, plot points, rising action, falling action. Like, to you, that's apparently not part of the story.
But I don't think that
like,
that's
all those
true.
Mechanical things are important.
No, I think that it's true. I think you still, like, that exists as the framework for everything you're doing. Right.
That is the story.
I feel like that's the emotional part of it, though.
No, that's not the It's completely the opposite of the emotional part. That's the actual story framework itself. And without that, you have a story like The Catcher in the Rye, which is crappy. So crappy.
So the rising action
Players
happens,
with no structure is how you get The Catcher in the Rye.
The rising action of the story happens because of emotional beats. It's high and low beats that go, like up and down, but on an arc, like slowly trending up to the climax. High beat, low beat, high beat, low beat. As they continually go a little higher, a little higher, a little higher.
But like ideally, and you're like the leader of the orchestra, making that all happen,
right?
And your plot follows that anyway. Yeah. The mechanical structure of the story also important.
My only thing for that is that I don't know that. Sometimes I wonder how much of this stuff we've internalized so much from telling stories and playing games, and I'm just a storyteller by nature anyway, even outside of gaming and all that stuff, right? I like to tell stories and tell a good yarn and whatever. And sometimes I wonder, like that story structure stuff, how much of it isn't just so internalized that it's just, I naturally do it when I tell a story, whether it's for a game or whether I'm, telling a silly story.
If you don't think about that to begin with, then you end up with stories that have no ending or stories that have no defined climax, and you feel differently about those stories. You don't have the same sense of fulfillment when things are finished if those things are not there.
But I didn't structure any of the Night Witches stuff with inherent climax or ending in them, I guess.
No, it's built into the game. The inherent ending is either death or retirement when you reach this base.
Right.
Like that, you didn't have to do that. It's already there.
But that's not...
That
that's
is
not
the end.
That's not the plot of that game, though. That's the sort of the setting where everything is revolving around. But
that's not just the setting. That's the end of the story. That's an important point.
I don't think I think we see it just differently, because in my mind
that's fine. I'm just saying.
Okay. Yeah. No. Right.
That my way of thinking is probably right.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. Whatever. I just think in terms of that, maybe that's a good example of it. The beginning and end of Night Witches obviously coincides with the war or your character's death. However, that's not the story to me. The reason I like Night Witches so much is the story is not about the war. The story is about the struggles and the lives of the women that are flying those planes in their day-to-day moments. At first, when I first started running the game, I really worried that our night cycles were so short. And I was like, what? Is it supposed to be this way? And I've come around to the decision, at least for our table, yes. Yes, it is. Because those moments in the planes should be quick, intense, deadly, and dangerous. But that's not the game. The game is on the ground.
Okay, but the game on the ground matters more because of those quick, intense moments in the sky.
I don't think you can have one without the other. I agree with that very much so.
Okay.
But those one mission isn't like the plots that are happening during the day phase are not, the climax is not the night mission. The climax is whatever. The climax is when Yuri gives you the ring, and then the resolution is he doesn't come back. The climax is that Vera gets terribly manipulated by Sveta, and she doesn't even realize the relationship that she's in, right? And there hasn't been resolution for that yet. The climax is Gallia realizing that Mikhail is the traitor, and the resolution is her shooting him, right? Those are the climaxes that end of the story that is happening, not the overall thing of it happening to end with the war. At least that's how it feels to me. No?
I think they're both important.
Well, I agree that they're both important. I just think that I think the framework of the game is the scaffolding that makes it work, right? And without it, it doesn't work. And I will totally concede that. But I don't think that what makes it really nice is that when you sort of zoom in, that scaffolding sort of fades away. And it's these terribly intense moments of terror and drama that are happening. And I think that's why that game works. So, all right, we're way off on to something totally different. But in a way not, because I think it comes back around ultimately to we're all telling this story together. And I think at least for me in my case, it's fair to say that Powered by the Apocalypse games made me much more comfortable with giving control of the story and agency of the story more to the players and getting me to come around to the idea of that happening much more often. I've always been kind of freeform in the way I do things, but I didn't always give players the agency that you get in a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games. And like most things, I think playing more games will always improve your game mastering and running games and telling stories. And even if you just read the books, because there are some of them that are very definitely worth a read. Burning Wheel is one of the ones I always point to, that I'm not a big fan of the physical game itself, but reading the book actually made me think about things a lot differently in terms of gaming. And the Apocalypse World, and there are several other ones that do that in a great way as well. So I think if you really want to improve your storytelling and running games, that even if you're just a D&D Pathfinder player, it's worth picking up the Fate Core book or getting it from download, or the Apocalypse World book, or Burning Wheel, and looking through those and seeing how they talk about structuring stories and telling different things and doing things slightly differently. So, Ron, do you have anything else to close this one out? Or I think we're done here. So
No, I don't think so.
this is a nice kind of like round conclusion to this one. I'm not sure that we got any resolution, but let us know what you think. I'm actually kind of curious to see what anybody else out there that has been, whether you've been telling stories and running games for, a very short time or for years and years and years, like some of us, and to just see where you come down on it, because it's a really interesting thought process, and it made me think of things a little bit differently. So, and if you want to hit us up, you can do that on our Facebook group, or hit us up on Twitter at Just One More Fix, or you can email me, James at Just One More Fix, and let us know what you think. As you know, remember the Gonna Geek Network. I don't have my phone up here with me, and I think it's dead anyway, so I can't really read off a promo for you guys. But there are lots and lots of great podcasts at GonnaGeekNetwork.com that you can go check out that have all kinds of awesome geeky content. And if you're a podcaster as well, you should check out the Better Podcasting podcast, as they have loads of technical advice and equipment reviews and all kinds of other awesome stuff. If you like what we do here at Just One More Fix, you can support us at patreon.com/JustOneMoreFix and get early access to all of our audio feeds, as well as our raw audio and pre-shows, and get access to our quarterly zine in PDF and print form, depending on what level you support at. And if you become a Patreon supporter, you can join the awesome ranks of all of our patrons, like Timothy Barra, Hector Treelane, Tiziano Furlano, Alistair H., Simon McNair, Alan White, and of course the OG titles. And I think that'll do it for us this week. And I just realized I think it's really cool that we see the stories the same way, but from such a drastically different perspective, that it's really kind of cool. So anyway, I think that'll do it for us this week, and we will see you guys next week.
Thanks for listening. This has been an episode of Just One More Fix. Music has been provided by Kevin MacLeod. You can find him at incompetech.com. You can support us at patreon.com/JustOneMoreFix, or follow us on Twitter at Just One More Fix.